Hello, and welcome back to the Fireside Lit Book Club, a quiet, candlelit corner of the internet where we read slowly, think deeply, and speak authentically about our experiences. I'm Lindsay, and I invite you to join me by the fire as we explore the soul of a book, the beauty it reveals, the questions it asks, and the ways it helps us understand life, identity, and meaning just a little more clearly. In today's episode, we're going to be talking all about Virginia Woolf and two of what I feel are probably her most complimentary works, Orlando and A Room of One's Own. And I want to kick things off this evening with a quote that was particularly memorable and thematic to me. This is from page 129 of my edition of Orlando. "I'm growing up," she thought, taking her taper. "I'm losing my illusions, perhaps to acquire new ones." So we're going to be exploring that idea of illusion tonight and what it means in the context of identity and maturing. But before we launch into that, I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a background about, my experience with Virginia Woolf. And I will start by saying that as much as I actually really, really like her these days, my first experience with Virginia Woolf was not a good one. I read what was arguably her most famous work in college, and that was Mrs. Dalloway. And I attempted that right on the heels of Ulysses by James Joyce, which I hated. I thought it was nonsense. I couldn't really make heads or tails of it. I was not used to reading work like that at the time. So here are these, similarly, I can't speak, similarly written books, because Virginia Woolf actually drew a lot of her inspiration from James Joyce and Ulysses after having had a similar experience to mine, which is simply that she read it, the first time and was like, this is incomprehensible. I hate this. And then she revisited it and actually came to the conclusion that James Joyce was a genius and she was going to try to model her writing a bit after his style, which is the stream of consciousness that I decided quite strongly was not for me. I thought it was just too experimental. It was really hard for me to follow at the time. And I just kind of, I learned basically that Virginia Woolf wrote this way pretty exclusively. She relied really heavily on the stream of consciousness and the experimental. So I came to the conclusion that she was not an author I was ever going to enjoy. But now, we are, I guess like 10 plus years down the line. And I can say that I guess it's true what they say about it being necessary to reread certain works or authors, because even though they don't change, you do. And at this point in my life, I've actually come to appreciate Virginia Woolf a great deal. And I've read most of her famous work at this point. I've read To the Lighthouse, Orlando, and A Room of One's Own, in addition to that first reading of Mrs. Dalloway, which I have not revisited, but at some point I think I would like to, and just kind of see what my experience is at this point. But anyway, what I love so much about Orlando in particular is its playfulness alongside some heavier themes. Even its satire, honestly. There were a couple moments in Orlando that made me chuckle, kind of like smirk to myself. And that was fun. It was fun kind of having those moments in a book that, takes a lot of effort and dedication to get through, because even though I got a lot out of it, it does kind of take a lot sometimes to stick with some of these more complex works. So I enjoyed that. And what I loved is alongside that playfulness, she really masterfully conveys meaningful lessons about who a person is and how much of that is influenced by the world around them. So you guys probably have heard the quote at some point or seen it, in a cute little design on Pinterest that goes, "Can you remember who you were before the world told you who you should be?" And I think that's a really fascinating question. It's this idea that who we may have actually been born to be is impacted significantly by our upbringing, our friends, our culture, definitely our social constructs. And in fact, there is an additional layer to that question when you throw in the theme of gender, which Virginia Woolf experiments with heavily in books like Orlando. So I will say, having come from a very religious, conservative background, gender and sexuality weren't things I ever thought twice about. And I think even apart from that, I grew up and experienced puberty in, I guess you would call it like the early 2010s, where sexuality wasn't something that was as openly discussed. It just wasn't really a hot button issue the way it is today. So there were a lot of things I always took for granted coming from that background. Number one, I believed that gender and sexuality were one and the same. So if you were born with two X chromosomes, you were female and therefore acted in inherently feminine ways. And if you had an X and a Y chromosome, you were male and therefore acted in masculine ways. And number two, I believed those traits or behaviors were fixed and intrinsic. So, obviously you carry biases from your childhood and long-held beliefs into works like Orlando, where Virginia Woolf was posing very bold questions to her readers about gender at the time of writing, which was 1928. She herself challenged the confines of being a woman at that time, and in fact, this novel is actually loosely written as a biography of her female lover named Vita Sackville West. And I approached the story not really knowing what to expect because I had heard that it is in some ways a novel about a sex change, and I found myself really wondering how that would play out since there were no transitions happening in 1928. Like that, I'm sure that this story was certainly one of a kind at that point, and this whole notion was kind of unheard of. So I was skeptical about how Virginia Woolf would accomplish this, but actually the way it is written is quite seamless. And basically after 30 years of living as a man, the main character, Orlando, simply wakes up one morning after a very long sleep, which that in and of itself could be symbolic of a lot of things, but he wakes up after this long sleep and he's a woman, and that's it. And what's striking about the transition is that Virginia Woolf writes, and this is from page 102 in my edition, Orlando had become a woman, there is no denying it. But in every other respect, Orlando remained precisely as he had been. The change of sex, though it altered the future, did nothing whatever to alter his identity. His face remained practically the same. His, now her, memory went back through all the events of her past life without encountering any new obstacle. The change seemed to have been accomplished painlessly and completely in such a way that Orlando herself showed no surprise at it. So what's clear is that, Virginia Woolf is trying to drive home the point that true sexuality, not gender norms or social constructs, does not affect a person's life experience, who they love, or the core of their identity. More arguments of this are posed in subsequent pages, for instance, on page 119. As all of Orlando's loves had been women now, through the culpable laggardy of the human frame to adapt itself to convention, though she herself was a woman, it was still a woman she loved. And if the consciousness of being the same sex had any effect at all, it was to quicken and deepen those feelings which she had as a man. Guys, a lot of this might sound self-evident to you, but these are not things I had ever stopped to consider pertaining to gender and sexuality. What I loved a lot about Orlando was that it helped me establish a new perspective of something I thought I would have one idea about forever. She helped me see things in a new way. And the power of this book for me was that it opened my mind to the reality that so much of what we consider to be male or female or masculine or feminine really are constructs. In fact, there's a really great line later on in the book where Orlando, as a woman, is conversing with a man she finds attractive, and he says something she realizes most women would find shocking. So she realizes that it's necessary for her to basically act shocked in order to maintain the social order. But the crazy thing is these types of norms and constructs are still happening all the time, even today. So a good example is, as a woman, there are just certain expectations of the way one should navigate interactions, especially with a man. She should ideally smile. She should be agreeable. Even if she is like rightfully annoyed or upset about anything, she shouldn't take up too much space, shouldn't speak too loudly or be too assertive. She should cushion her statements so they don't sound too demanding or forceful. She should be, alluring and demure, but not overly sexual. She should be compassionate and understanding. And she should be, willing to compromise always, even at the expense of herself. And thinking back over all of that, honestly, it's practically my character description. And a lot of that is just a mask I wear that I have learned to take on and off depending on my present company. And I'll be honest, there's not much company I feel I can be 100% my truest self in. But I don't know, maybe the universality of this is that to some extent, many of us feel the need to mask in public. Like personally, I'm constantly scanning others' moods, deciding how to respond, even what the pitch of my voice should be based on how they're interacting with me, which I know is not great. That is not ideal. And I'm not sure if it's a survival mechanism or just a coping mechanism, but either way, it's pretty nuts. And no wonder I go home at the end of a social outing and pop a Tylenol. I get a headache every damn time. But anyway, I'm digressing a little bit. Anyway, all this brings me to another prominent work of Virginia Woolf's that I actually ended up reading alongside Orlando, which was the famous A Room of One's Own. And she originally wrote this as a lecture series for female graduates at the University of Cambridge. And the points she brings up in this book are illuminating and honestly for me were pretty humbling because as a 21st century woman, despite all of the, masks that I just described that, we're still having to constantly put on, or we feel we have to anyway. But as a 21st century woman, there are some pretty serious and damaging discriminatory practices that were levied against women for hundreds and hundreds of years. But actually reading about the specifics made me appreciate my current privilege and how many female casualties there were before me. Virginia Woolf as a writer specifically focuses on female writers. And she really just drives home the point that women were not given space, time, or money to be creative. Female authors like Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, and George Eliot, who that was her pseudonym. Her real name was Mary Ann Evans. But they wrote in spite of their circumstances. They were expected first and foremost to manage the home and to put their energy into household affairs. And as a result, many of them felt they had to actually hide their work when others walked in the room because it would be seen as a distraction. And speaking of distractions, there was no end to the number of distractions a woman would face while trying to write. She would often set up shop in the drawing room, which was a common area, and, her parents, husband, or children might disrupt her at any time. So, when you compare this to, and this was Virginia Woolf's point, but when you compare this to some of the great male writers of the Western world, like Shakespeare, Alexander Pope, Robert Browning, they all had either the freedom to pursue their craft wholeheartedly, the experiences needed to shape it in a unique and original way, and also the finances to support themselves while they were in the process of creating. So in A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf poses a theoretical question. If Shakespeare had had an equally gifted sister, what would have become of her? And, would her work ever be known or heralded the way that Shakespeare's was? And the answer is overwhelmingly and very dismally no. The confines of her gender and the disadvantages of her sex would never have allowed it. On page 70 of A Room of One's Own, Woolf writes, Charlotte Bronte knew how enormously her genius would have profited if it had not spent itself in solitary visions over distant fields, if experience and intercourse and travel had been granted her. But they were not granted, they were withheld, and we must accept the fact that all those good novels, Villette, Emma, Wuthering Heights, Middlemarch, were written by women without more experience of life than could enter the house of a respectable clergyman, written too in the common sitting room of that respectable house, and by women so poor that they could not afford to buy more than a few squires of paper at a time upon which to write Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre. She then goes on to compare these famous female authors to Leo Tolstoy, which, he wrote War and Peace and Anna Karenina. And she says, at the same time, on the other side of Europe, there was a young man living freely with this gypsy or with that great lady, going to the wars, picking up unhindered and uncensored all that varied experience of human life which served him so splendidly later when he came to write his books. Had Tolstoy lived at the Priory in seclusion with a married lady, cut off from the world, and I'll just stop here to say this was the case with Mary Ann Evans, also known as George Eliot, who fell in love with and lived in seclusion with the married man, he could scarcely have written War and Peace. As a female author myself, this really struck me because I was forced to think about how my writing might be affected by a lack of opportunity and experience and just fewer encounters with the world had I lived during a time when those things were not afforded to me based on gender. And it's actually infuriating because it's clear that women had to play by rules and social constructs overwhelmingly created to benefit and serve men and keep men in power to the detriment of women. When I think about the things I've drawn inspiration from as a writer, it's been, from my education, my travels, all kinds of real world experiences that I would have never been exposed to had I lived during Jane Austen's time, or honestly, even Virginia Woolf's time. I simply would not have had the same freedoms, and my writing would be inferior for it. Not to mention, I know more than ever as a mom of an 8-month-old now, just how important space and privacy is to actually fuel creativity. So Woolf's insistence that a woman have time and money and a room of their own to write and retreat to and simply think in makes more sense to me than ever. I think it was something I took for granted a lot prior to motherhood, just that I would always have all this time to focus on my passions. But the truth is, you just need space to breathe, let alone feel and think and create. So when you look at the social climate prior to the 21st century, women were just not afforded this luxury. The demands of the house and of their husbands and of their children just always came first. And, I don't think there's anything wrong with having that primary responsibility to your family, but you should also and equally have a responsibility to yourself to do the things that make you come alive, to put pen to paper, or to devote time to anything else that serves your purpose and makes you a better version of yourself. So ultimately, Orlando and A Room of One's Own meant so much to me because they shattered, back to this idea of illusion, some long-held illusions I've had about gender, but also forced me to consider the privileges I've taken for granted as a modern woman. This idea of illusion is really, really powerful for me as Woolf presents it because she equates losing illusions with growing older. And this is only an idea I've accepted as necessary and good as I have grown older. When I was younger, I think this is typical of most people, but I accepted everything at face value, and I was conditioned in a lot of senses to merely believe certain things or accept certain things without fully understanding them. And now that I've grown and experienced more of the world and have begun to understand more about other people's experiences, I'm in a place where for the first time, my own illusions are being shattered. And I can't say that's a bad thing. It's definitely a bit disorienting at times, but I honestly think it's also one of the best things to ever happen to me. So I will conclude by saying that if you've never read Virginia Woolf, or if it's maybe been years, it's worth spending some time with what she has to say. Books like this are definitely the reason why I read, even when I don't feel like it. Even when at times it can feel difficult to pick up great works by authors like this, when turning on the TV or scrolling through Instagram would offer more instant gratification. Books like this continue to be resonant and important, Even if they once spoke to concepts and ideas that seem just self-evident to us now, they're ultimately never finished saying what they have to say, and I think that's where their power lies. Thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to hosting you around the hearth again very soon. Happy reading.